Look, thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to start with the monumental piece of hypocrisy, which has to do with the profit motive, because there's a book here which the author is Dr. Liz Elliott. The book is brilliant, and it encompasses a great deal of what Tim has just analysed. And I'm going to flog it for $5, and all the profits will go to the running of politics in the pub, so that we, okay. So it's a communal investment, not a for-profit motive. Okay, that gets me off the hook. No, I'm not getting anything for it. No, that would be. I wouldn't let you know, Alice. Anyway. And the other thing I have to say, I'm not being modest. Here's a novel about a common good. It's called A Lover's Country, which is a conception of a common good, but in this case for the people of Palestine. It's a racy story, and that's for $10, but the profits again to politics in the pub. Okay, look, I acknowledge the point that Tim made at the beginning about the crucial momentum of history that is given to us, that wonderful legacy from the indigenous people of Australia. And we'll come to that later, because I want to talk about the way in which a different set of values, the kind of values that were running through almost every sentence in Tim's address, how they can influence a different kind of politics, how they can help to craft a different set of policies. That's the conundrum for me. I mean, those of us who agree with one another can run with the agenda you've just mentioned. I have a more difficult problem, which is talking to people who think that discovering the price of a special on pork chops in Coles or Woolies is really a weekend priority. So I want to talk about, just quickly, about values like altruism, like interdependence, like non-violence, and ask how would they influence a different kind of politics, and how would they lead to a different set of policies. I'm going to talk about 4 things. Usually I only talk about 3, Mary. Is that okay? I'm going to go to 4, but still keep it within 15 minutes. Okay. I want to talk about the world of work and income. I want to talk about what a more what sort of economy would be produced by a different democracy. And then I want to look more specifically at the way interdependence and altruism would affect policies, and finally, how would non-violence affect domestic and foreign policies. So that should take us to the end of 15 minutes. Now, probably most of the people in this room have lived by the formula, or many of us would have, that you get a job, you get work with a reasonable income, enough to pay for a home or rent, even in a city like Sydney, gives you access to healthcare and opportunities in education. And we think we're called relatively successful. But the same formula doesn't work at all for a large number of people who are unemployed or underemployed, who are part of what is now being called the gig economy, the casualization of labor, or people with serious illness or struggling with a disability. But even those of us who are successful, our success is built on a certain an illusion. The illusion that our success is somehow divorced from the exploitation of people in other parts of the world. Our success is built on the notion that we can consume without ever thinking about the consequences, such as pollution. I'm impressed by recent surveys in Britain that show that up to 40% of people, for example, this is the illusory bit about the world of work, think that their jobs were of no consequence whatsoever. They had bored them out of their minds for almost the whole of their working lives. More specifically, that wonderful George Monbiot in The Guardian has just written a piece which says that people in occupations like advertising, mining, banks, the production of arms, do enormous harm to the world. But the harm, as the harm increases, so does the return to the shareholders. In other words, a great deal of work is monumentally destructive, and some is so boring that even robots don't want to do them. So the question then becomes, and this issue was posed years ago by a brilliant French economist, André Gortz, when he talked about the need to have satisfying work alongside balanced lives. How would you manage that? And in that respect, of course, the issue becomes the choice of work. Most people are now saying, well, most of the creative work that they do, the participatory work that contributes enormously to mental and physical health, is done after work or after they've retired. So the question then becomes, this is a reference to the importance of the universal basic income. And we've addressed that here. I think we have to keep on addressing it till it becomes almost a taken for granted part of every conversation. The idea that a basic income is a right of every citizen, paid in this country at the rate of the pension. The arguments are that it would not only deal with poverty at a stroke, but would contribute enormously to social solidarity. Let me drift from that to the second issue I wanted to talk about, which is how do we think about an economy that would be reflective of a different democracy or the other way around? There's a wonderful author called Tony Judt who wrote a book called Ill Fares the Land. It was largely, but not entirely, about the consequences of free market policies across the United States, but in many other parts of the world. Basically, and here we're talking about the conversations we need to have, the words we need to use. He said, well, for decades now, the questions asked about the nature of economy have been about whether it was productive, whether it would lead to growth, that it was never, and whether it was efficient. He said the criteria like, did it contribute to justice? Did it contribute to well-being? Were never asked. In the same vein, there's a wonderful book came out last year by Nancy MacLean called Democracy in Chains, in which she looks at the attempt in the United States and therefore by corporate influence around the world to argue that only people who are willing to do so should pay taxes. And she says, look, there's a huge struggle going on between the idea of economic freedom on the one hand and political liberty on the other. Economic freedom means you can go to a gun show in the United States and buy whatever you like, and your freedom, the notion of freedom, entitles you to do what you like with it. That's economic freedom. I mean, whereas the argument about political liberty is that liberty only comes from the intervention that says my freedom to do what I like ceases where it interferes with yours. Again, in similar vein, there's a brilliant book by Paul Mason about post-capitalism, when he imagines the sort of society that Tim's been thinking about, a carbon-free and emission-free, a society in which we really realize that the biggest generation of jobs in the future is about protecting the planet. That not merely from the employment that comes from being committed to renewable energy, but the need to protect forest habitats, to protect precious and diminishing water supplies, and to deal with the permanent, it's not a crisis, the permanent problem of the massive movement of people around the world, 65 million refugees, for example. In addition to that, Mason says, look, there's one thing governments can all do immediately, and that's to turn off the neoliberal privatization tap. And I wish Gladys Berejiklian's not here tonight, is she? Or they're her appalling predecessor, that smooth young man with the smiling face. What was his name? Baird. So no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't drift into polemics. I'll withdraw, even though some of you liked it. Let me go from that to those issues in the economy about the language of justice, the language of protection of the environment, and the absurdity. Well, it's an old argument about collective interests over private ones, to get rid of what Galbraith and R.H. Tawney in 1911 called private interest versus public squalor or private interest. Let me have a look now. Let me come to the specific challenge of how we would, how policies of altruism, how the value of altruism would affect the way we think about policies. We might look immediately at the responsibility of a rich country like this to be an international citizen. We can't really talk about our own backyard. That's absurd argument that the too many politicians from both parties have argued that we'll do something about controlling our pollution when other countries do so before us. The responsibility to give humanitarian aid is an obvious example of altruism at work. The United Nations sets the bar at 0.7% of gross national income. Australia our contribution has been declining massively since the coalition came to power in 2013. It's now 0.22%. A country which is 1/5 the size of Australia, namely Norway, gives 1.11%, 5 times what we give. Let me go from that to really the social policy, economic policy issue that's always made me more passionate than anything else, which is to have a policy that says that nobody should be financially penalized for being sick. That's about Medicare and universal health insurance. That, for me, is the basis of the civil society. It's about what anthropologists called the gift. It wasn't anthropologists called it. It was people, indigenous people, actually knowing how to live together. What they called the gift relationship. The gift given to the stranger without the expectation of reward. I was taught that public policy should always be about the dominance of altruism over egoism. So there are lots I could go on. We could spend time looking at, for example, how that would work, how those values would work in the recrafting of an institution such as a university. Universities have become business operations. They've become totally preoccupied with profit. The idea that education as a priority is miles off the agenda. We need to be thinking about how to relate to the appalling hierarchies of authority in the past for the management in universities. We need to give people, students and staff, security. The idea that there's a great con game going on, which is that all the students are full-time, but none of them are full-time. And they're customers. They're commodities to be bought and sold like second-hand cars on the Prince's Highway. And the third characteristic which we need to apply to that institution concerns the idea of having debt-free education. I'll come quickly to the last issue, which is about how the values of interdependence and non-violence, how would they affect policies? And Tim mentioned without referring specifically to the Uluru Statement, for the indigenous coming together, and the almost immediate rejection of Turnbull by that. They brought to us the notion of makarata, a making of peace, a coming together. What could be more? We ought to have been enormously grateful for that. It's a sort of Australian Aboriginal repetition of the Zulu word Ubuntu, I am because you are. Right? That's a wonderful expression of of interdependence. And as for, well, we can drift to think about the way we have treated asylum seekers and refugees. There's no concept of interdependence. They are separate from us. They're not really human. Besides, most of them are people of color. So they don't really belong. And yet, I want to hear in the parliament and in local government an expression of interdependence, without which we're all lost. Not paying a fortune, 5 billion over the past 4 years, to imprison people on Manus Island and Nauru. The last point about non-violence really brings us to what one of our colleagues who was speaking here a couple of weeks ago regarded as the greatest threat to all of us: the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons. A group of Australians about 5 or 6 years ago formed the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. And I think last year, in the middle of last year, at the UN, they, through their negotiating and bargaining and communication skills, they got 122 countries to sign up to the Nuclear Abolition Treaty. And as a result of that, they won the Nobel Peace Prize in December in Oslo. But the leading politicians in this country did not even have the courtesy to congratulate them. But in the same breath, Christopher Pyne and Malcolm Turnbull have just offered almost $3.8 billion to any entrepreneurs, any company that is willing to manufacture weapons, so that Australia can move from its 20th place in the league table of arms exporters to 10th place. So there's this huge mismatch between the enormous achievement of the Melbourne-based group, ICANN, and the fascination with violence as a way to solve problems that has been generated by the government. I want to finish with a reference to 1513, as though nothing is new. Sir Thomas More, he was the advisor to Henry VIII. Eventually, Henry, as an expression of gratitude, chopped off his head, as far as I recall. But he wrote a book called Utopia, and it was about the common good. It argued that people shouldn't work for more than 6 hours a week, and that women and men should have exactly the same education. Can you imagine that? In 1513. And I'll finish, and people in audiences like this are always grateful when a speaker uses the verb to finish. There's a good mate of mine, Alex Mitchell, used to be the editor of the Sun Herald. He was on the Sunday Times Inside team. He wrote a biography called Come the Revolution. And he says, he's trying to deal with the common good, and he poses a question to an audience like this. Hands up all of those of you who think that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the major retail banks and Goldman Sachs and the oil, mining and gas companies are going to preserve the environment and produce a sense of social justice in a different society. I'll leave that question with you.